Ms. Leach, if you'd like, you can bring our consultant into the meeting. Through you, Mr. Mayor, it is 4:32, and you do have all members of council and the consultant. You may begin your meeting.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Good evening, Council, SLT, and members of the viewing public. I see that I do indeed have quorum, so I call in session this Committee of the Whole for Monday, February 7th at 4:32. And at this time, we will call on Councillor Kaur to read the land recognition statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. We begin this meeting by acknowledging the land on which we gather. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaty and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resource and friendship of these great and proud people.
Thank you, Councillor. Madam Clerk.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I do have a motion put forth by Councillor Olson that the agenda be amended to include an addendum item number 4.3.1. To you, Mr. Mayor, for discussion.
Okay, any discussion on this amendment from councils? Not seeing any?
Thank you. This vote begins with Councillor Hahn.
Yes.
Councillor Hildebrandt.
Yes.
Councillor Kaur.
Yes.
Councillor Stewart.
Yes.
Councillor Olson.
Yes.
Councillor Wink.
Yes.
Mayor Junkin.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That does carry. I do have a motion put forth by Councillor Olson that the agenda for the February 7th, 2022 special meeting of committee be adopted as amended. To you, Mr. Mayor, for any comment.
Okay, any comment on the agenda as a whole? Not seeing any, Madam Clerk?
Thank you. And this begins with Councillor Hahn.
Yes.
Councillor Hildebrandt.
Yes.
Councillor Kaur.
Yes.
Councillor Stewart.
Yes.
Councillor Olson.
Yes.
Councillor Wink.
Yes.
Mayor Junkin.
Yes.
Thank you. That does carry. To you, Mr. Mayor, that brings you to the disclosure of pecuniary interest.
Thank you. After viewing the agenda, is there any councillor that has a pecuniary interest to declare? Not seeing
Excuse
any.
me.
Oh, Councillor Kaur.
And maybe I could direct this to either the CEO or Holly. The public input 5.3, it's just a statement or is it a report?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I may so. This is some comments that were received from members of the public, and for tonight is just being received for information.
Okay, so I don't have a conflict.
Thank you. I have so noted.
Thank you, Councillor. Go ahead to you, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I do have some opening remarks. I'd ask Ms. Leach if she can just share her screen.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a public meeting under the Development Charges Act for Monday, February 7th, 2021 at 4:30. All Town of Pelham in-person meetings have been canceled. Instead, the town is holding all meetings electronically via Zoom. Please note, no decisions have been made prior to this public meeting. Watson and Associates will be providing a presentation regarding the proposed policies and changes. Participants are reminded, please ensure that your background is free from offensive or vulgar material. If inappropriate material is visible, you will be removed from the meeting. Vulgar or offensive language will not be tolerated. If inappropriate language is used, you will be removed from the meeting. Participants will remain in the waiting room until they are called to speak. Once your comments have been heard by council, your microphone will be muted and staff will turn off your cameras. The Zoom chat is not being monitored nor recommended to contact the clerk's department during the meeting. Please contact us at email clerks@pelham.ca. This email address is being monitored during the meeting. Decorum. The public meeting under the Development Charges Act is a formal public hearing requiring decorum, meaning all comments are to be made through the chair. If you have pre-registered to speak, you will be given an opportunity to address council at the public portion of the meeting. If you are live streaming and wish to submit comments live, please email clerks@pelham.ca. Please note, comments must be received during the public portion of the meeting, otherwise they will not be considered. Disrespectful comments will not be tolerated. Please note, if decorum is lost, the meeting may be recessed and persons asked to leave. Opening remarks. Tonight's council is holding a public meeting under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended. The purpose of the meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the 2022 Development Charges Background Study. This study calculates new development charges for parks and recreation, library, and growth studies services. Prior to receiving the public comments, we will ask our consultant, Watson and Associate Economics Limited, to do a brief presentation of the findings of the study. Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Ms. Leach can stop sharing her screen. To you, Mr. Mayor, that does bring us to our presentation by our consultant, and we do have Watson and Associates here, and it is Mr. Tan representing them.
Okay, and you have the floor, sir.
Good afternoon, through the chair, members of council. Thank you very much for having us today. We do have a presentation prepared. Is this something that I could share my screen?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see that. Is everyone able to see the screen right now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you through the chair and through members of council and staff. I'm here today on behalf of Watson Associates to a presentation under the Development Charges Act as a public meeting for your development charge update study. Just a quick format of the meeting today. So we'll have our opening remarks. We'll review the presentation. I'll provide an overview of the presentation with respect to the proposed policies and charges. And then if there are any comments from the public, this is the opportunity to do so. And then any questions from council, I'm more than happy to answer questions throughout the presentation, although sometimes it is a segue into my next slide. So if there are any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will be taking them as well at the end. And then that'll be the public meeting for today. Just wanted to provide a quick overview. So with the study process, we started, were retained by the town back in September of 2021. We had reviewed we had undertaken a number of calculations and reviewed policies that would be incorporated as part of this development charge update study. We released the background study back in December 22nd of 2021, and we're here today at the public meeting on February 7th. Now, the next step after this is the council's consideration of the bylaw on March 7th. And one of the changes as part of the Development Charges Act and what is required is for the study to be released a minimum of 60 days before the town can consider the passage of the bylaw. And as you can see, based on the dates from December to March, we have conformed to that requirement. So the purpose of this DC update is to incorporate a a couple of changes into the town's DC bylaw. I'd like to note that this is not a full DC study. This is an interim study in order to accommodate the points that you're seeing on the screen. The first one being that we are incorporating policy changes as a result of the following bills: 108, 138, 197, and 213. And excuse me, I will be referencing the bills by number rather than their names, just because they are pretty lengthy. I know the bill numbers tend to be cycled, but for our purposes here, I will use this for reference throughout the presentation. Part of the changes as well that we're undertaking is the removal of the mandatory 10% deduction. Historically, as part of the 1997 Act, any capital projects that were included for recovery within the development charges, they weren't related to hard services. And what I mean by that are services related to water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, or fire. So these are more your softer services like parks and recreation or library. If there was a project that was included and deemed to be 100% DC recoverable, there was a clause that you had to include a mandatory 10% deduction. So a quick example, if you had $1 million project that was deemed 100% growth, at the end of the day, we could only collect $900,000 because there was a mandatory 10%. Bill 197, which is the third bill that's referenced above, actually removed this mandatory deduction. So now anything that may be 100% growth does not need a further 10% deduction. And then finally, one of the main reasons that we're also undertaking this DC update is to recalculate the DC recovery for the town's Meridian Community Center. If you recall, I did present this back 2 years ago in 2019, where we increased the development charge related to the recovery for the Meridian Community Center. And we're coming back again 2 years later in order to do that same update. And based on the last two points, just briefly, the meeting is a mandatory requirement under the Development Charges Act, so it is mandatory that we have this public meeting. And as I mentioned earlier, the background study must be available to the public a minimum of 60 days prior to the DC bylaw. So just as a quick refresher, development charges, they are there to recover capital costs associated with residential and non-residential growth in the municipality. And these are typically costs that would be in excess or above and beyond what you would require a local developer to construct and provide as part of their subdivision costs. So your internal roads, internal water mains, sidewalks, street lights, etc. So this is more for capital projects that are for the broader sense of the municipality. And municipalities are empowered to impose these charges under the DCA. It's not mandatory that you have a development charge, but it is a tool in order to help recover for these costs. So just as an overview of the legislation that has taken place and updated the DCA since the last time we updated the study, as I mentioned, there are 4 bills, Bill 108 being the first one. Really what this bill did was essentially taken away, it proposed to take away a lot of the services that were historically part of the development charge recovery. And then they're also introduced a number of timing of payment provisions, which I'll touch upon in the next slide. A lot of these provisions actually did not come into effect. There was only select ones that actually moved forward as of January 1st, 2020. With the remainder of the proposals under Bill 108 being revised under the subsequent bills under 138 and 197. Bill 138, as you can see here, it did amend Bill 108, which removed the installment payments required for commercial and industrial developments. Again, I'll touch upon that in the next slide, but as I said, Bill 108 was more introducing timing of payment provisions, and Bill 138 revised that. 197 probably is the largest bill here that revised a lot of the development charges that you're going to see tonight. It essentially allowed for certain 20 services to be allowed to be remaining within the development charge regime and to be recovered moving forward. For the town, there is really no change to your services, but we also now have the ability to, again, remove the 10% deduction, as well as include interest costs, and I'll touch upon that. And then for Bill 213, this is really provided an exemption for DCs for any development that would be occurring on university lands. So just to briefly touch on Bill 108 and 138, this was introduced back in May of 2019 and essentially was proclaimed at the end of the year 2019. Now, a lot of the items that were included in that bill were not passed, but the ones that were did move forward as of January 1st, 2020 are presented on the bottom of this slide. So the first one is the timing of payment, what relates to rental housing and institutional developments. So if you have an application that it falls under this criteria, they will be allowed to pay their development charges over 6 installments. So really over 5 years, so 6 annual installments, with the first one being, an occupancy. And as you can see there on the note, Bill 138 actually removed the payments required for commercial and industrial. So initially, this 6 equal payments also applied to commercial and industrial, but now it only remains with the rental housing and institutional developments. The second bullet there, nonprofit housing, they're allowed to pay their DCs over 21 equal installments or 20 years. So, this allows for them to be able to, get stage their payments to be a little bit more financially, easier for them to be able to make the payments. And there is also ways, if they choose not to pay over 21 years, even for the first bullet as well, they could pay everything at one time during building permit, if that's an agreement that they do enter it with the town. The third bullet just talks about the DC rate freeze, and I'll just briefly explain this. So when a municipality receives a site plan or zoning bylaw application, this then triggers a freezing of the DC rates at the time. And so for the example here, if a developer were to come in with either a site plan or zoning bylaw amendment, whatever the rates as of the date that the application is approved, 2 years from then, the DC rates that are in effect as of today, if the application was approved today, would be frozen up until 2 years, from now. If for any reason that they take out a building permit at 2 years and 1 day, then the rate freeze is lifted and the charges that would be payable would be the DCs effective as of that time. So as long as they pull a building permit within this 2-year time horizon, the DCs are frozen. The bullet talks about the interest rates that could be a charge to these installments and rate freeze. So, the DCs do get indexed every year in order to help keep with inflation. So what the province had done as well is provide a interest rate clause that the municipalities are allowed to invoke. And essentially you can apply interest rates to these these annual payments or to the rate freeze. So that way it could at least help alleviate with any increases, due to inflation. Bill 197, so this was one of the larger changes to the Development Charges Act, and this was tabled back in July of 2020. And it essentially now outlines what DC eligible services we can include as part of the Development Charges Act. Historically, in the 1997 Act, the Act referenced what services we couldn't provide for. Now the Act is now specifying what services you could provide for. It's a subtle change. However, with the 1997 iteration, being told what you can't collect for really opens the door possibility of what you can collect under the Development Charges Act versus next, it's stating exactly what services you can collect for as part of the DC. The second bullet talks about the classes of service, which may be established for components of a service or combination of services. So what this means is if you have any of the services, and I'll show it in a second on the next slide, if any of the services, you would like to combine it for any reason. For example, if let's say, for example, you have a public works facility, but that public works facility is not necessarily a DC eligible service, but it does provide for servicing of DC eligible services. So you'll have a public works facility that takes care of your roads, and then it may also have employees that also take care of the water and wastewater. So you could combine, you could create a class of service for public works, which then is taking care of your roads, water, and wastewater, which are eligible services. So this is really something minor that doesn't really impact the town per se and any of the calculations. It's just an added level of calculations that we have to do in order to make sure that we're conforming with the legislation. Bullet, it talks about the mandatory 10%. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this DC update as well is to remove that 10% for all DC eligible services. And then the 10-year planning horizon, which was limiting certain soft services. So for example, your parks and rec, if you had, library, web version, et cetera, those were historically limited to a 10-year planning horizon. Now all the planning horizons have been removed except for transit. So if you do have any master plans or any official plans that, look at these type of services more on a longer term, we could utilize those longer term forecasts as part of the calculations now. So this slide just summarizes the DC eligible services that are captured now under Bill 197. You can see here it is limited to 20 services, anywhere from water, wastewater, all the way to airports. And with respect to airports, Waterloo region, is the only one that is eligible. So they were the only ones that actually, really asked the province in order for them to stay within the development charge framework. The services that are highlighted in yellow are the town's current services, and that's what we're proposing to continue moving forward. And then briefly on Bill 213, as I mentioned, any development that would be constructed on university lands, and it does receive operating funds from upper levels of government, would have their development charges exempt. So this change will be reflected in the amending DC bylaw. So the next few slides just talk about the updates to the DC study for the town. So this first one that we had done was the removal of the 10%. So you could see here that we did remove it for indoor and outdoor recreation, which now we're calling parks and recreation, because if you notice on the previous slide, they don't separate out indoor and outdoor recreation. It's actually combined. Again, it doesn't impact the town with respect to any of your administrative, ways of collecting for the DC. It just means that we're just, combining the two together. Library services, we're also removing the 10%, and then administration studies. And I'll touch upon that on the next slide, but we're now calling it a class of service, which we're now renaming to growth studies. So the town, as I mentioned, has the category called administration, which contains all of your DC eligible studies. However, with the changes to Bill 197, we now have to consider this a class of service, because the studies that are included as part of that service category actually examines a number of different services. So for example, we may have an official plan in there, which looks at, all of your different services. We have perhaps maybe a road study, which is related to the services related to highway. So anything that, would be appropriately classified as one of the other services has now been really just wrapped around in a bow, called it class of service. As I mentioned, there is no change to how the town administers this or collects. It's just really just a naming of the service and just an additional step that we have to do for our calculations. And then there's a couple of capital adjustments that we've undertaken for this DC update. So as I mentioned earlier, we are amending the DC recovery for the Meridian Community Center. So we are adjusting it similar to how we had done back in 2019. Now that we're 2 years into the the community center being available for the public for them to use, your service standard ceiling has increased, and therefore we can now recover more of the post-period amount that we had allocated before. And then with respect to studies, with certain planning-related studies, we've made a deduction of 10% to recognize the extent that some of the studies may be related to services that aren't DC eligible. So it may not fall within those 20 services that I'd shown you earlier. So just to be conservative, we've allocated a 10% deduction for those as well. And then finally, other bylaw revisions. As I mentioned, we are going to be including the timing of payment provisions in your bylaw. So this is to recognize, again, the rental housing institutional developments, the nonprofit housing, the DC rate freeze, and then the interest rates associated with the above. As well, there are some additional policies and definitions as described and provided under Ontario Regulation 45419. So these are now updated definitions, with respect to the nonprofit housing, rental, institutional, as well as other policies. We'll be including as part of the development charge, the amending bylaw. So what you're seeing here on this screen is the current DC rates. So it's as of your bylaw 4023, 2018. And as you recall, it was amended in 2019 with bylaw 4149. How we do the calculation, since we are amending the original bylaw that was passed in 2018, all the numbers that you're going to see tonight, other than except for the survey, is presented in 2018 dollars, because that's where the original calculations were based on. So therefore, we had to put everything in 2018. Subsequent to the passing of the bylaw, the amending bylaw, any charges that are presented tonight would then have to be indexed back to what you are currently imposing as of 2022. So there is a little bit of little calculation that needs to be done, and your finance department, will be happy to help them with any of those transitions. So as you can see here, currently from your bylaw as amended by the 2019 one, your charge is currently at $18,428 for a single and semi-detached. And as you can see, as we go down the list, the smaller the type of unit, the charge is reflective of it. So again, with multiples being smaller than a single, it's now to $13,129. And then we have the two different apartments, 2 bedrooms plus, and then bachelor and 1 bedroom being $12,600 and $7,700 respectively. And then the special care special units, this is more your retirement home, your Chartwell style homes, they're on $6,300 per unit. And then as well, we also provide a non-residential charge of $9.06 per square foot. So due to the changes, as noted earlier, the slide that you're seeing here is the calculated DC rates. As you can see, the services that are in yellow are what's been provided for the recalculation of your DCs. So now this provides a new single detached charge of $20,199, so just under $20,200. And again, as we're moving down the list, the smallest charge being $6,900 for your special care. And then on a non-residential basis, we're looking at $9.32 per square foot. I just want to note that that footnote at the bottom where the above figures would need to be indexed to 2022. Just like to make a correction that 20+% actually relates to if this charge was related to your previous bylaw that wasn't amended in 2019. If we're looking at it from the 20,199, from your 2019 bylaw as amended, it's actually a 17% increase to 2022. So I just wanted to make that correction. Just this slide here just provides a rate comparison between the current bylaw versus the new calculations as of today. So as you can see, we went from $18,428, and the calculations here now increase to $20,199. For non-residential, we go from $9.06 per square foot to $9.32 per square foot. Again, with the changes being with the Parks and Rec, library, the growth studies. The next couple of slides just provide a survey of comparison of the development charges in 2022 dollars. So again, I apologize for bouncing around, but now this is actually what the charges are with respect to your neighbors as of January of this year. So we're in 2022. So you can see, Lincoln being the highest, in between looking at the Niagara region DC as well as their local DC. They're over $60,000 per single detached, and then and that's within Camden, followed by the remainder of Lincoln, which is just over 50,000. And then with yourselves in Pelham, whether you're in Fenwick or Font Hill, if you're receiving urban services, really you're climbing up from 43 to about 45,000 total. And then as you can see, all the other all the other municipalities following suit. The only one that I would note is different is Wainfleet. As you can see, their regional charge, and I apologize, the regional charge actually is the one that you see in the yellow or orange. And then the blue, the slate, is the lower tier charge. Wainfleet is different because they do not have water and wastewater servicing, and that's why their regional charge is lower than the rest of the other municipalities. Similarly for commercial, as you can see here, you're still in the same place relative to Lincoln and then the rest of the other municipalities. Again, total on a per square foot basis, you're moving, from just under $25 to around $25 per square foot. And then with respect to industrial, you've remained at the top within the region. Again, not really moving the envelope here, or moving the needle, I should say. You are moving from just over $16 to approximately the same amount. And I just like to make the footnote there that Niagara region does provide an exemption for brownfield development in the DC bylaw, as well as an industrial DC grant through a program outside of DC bylaw. So any of the development charges that you are seeing here with respect to industrial may not be imposed depending on whether the development receives that grant funding. And that concludes my presentation. The next steps would be to pass the bylaw on March 7th. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you for a great presentation. Council, I see Wayne, Councillor Olson has his hand up. Go ahead, Councillor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering on your slide that DC eligible charges, DC per bill 197, item number 3, the rationale for stormwater drainage, which I'm going to define, and it may be wrong in defining it this way, but as our stormwater ponds. Could you explain why that would not be included in your recommendations? Help me understand that.
Yeah. So as of right now, through the chair, to answer your question, Councillor, as of right now for the DC, this is a DC update. So we're not proposing to change or add any services that weren't already considered back in 2018. I believe most of your stormwater drainage, and I'll have to double check, I believe a lot of it is through your local service policy, which means that you do require local subdivisions or local developers to construct their stormwater as well as associated ponds to service their area. So that would be already something that is captured from their local costs as part of the local service. But if this is something that perhaps you'd like to explore into the next DC study, I'd be happy to work with council as well as staff in order to consider this service.
Okay. So through you, Mr. Mayor, I guess that means that that the maintenance of the ponds would be probably the eligible expenses under my explanation, and that probably falls into the regular budget of the annual budget for maintenance, I suppose. I'm gonna just guess.
I mean, through the chair, I mean, I could answer that. With respect to maintenance, that is considered an operating item.
Yeah.
With DCs, it's only for new capital that would be servicing growth. So if there was an initiative that the town was undertaking with respect to, construction of a new storm pond, that would be outside of local service policy, then that's something that we could consider.
Yes, thank you for that. And number 19, emergency preparedness. I could see an emergency preparedness item under climate change, and extreme weather would be the same thing. Consider in in the next phase, the next step?
Through the chair, yes, that would be something if you'd like to pursue. We could work with town staff in order to take a look at that for the next study. As I mentioned, the scope of this one was just to update the existing services as it relates to Parks and Rec, library, and studies. But if this is something that you do have any potential capital works into the future and would like to include as part of the DC, this is something that could be examined.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, through again to the consultant, when you say special dwelling units, that's not the secondary dwelling units, is it, that we've approved?
No, it is not. These special dwellings that we talk about are more of like the Chartwell style homes, so like a retirement home, where it's, a portion of it is residential, where the seniors would live, and then you'd have a portion of the building as well that would be more on the the assisted portion with the doctors, nurses, etc. Maybe a little boutique store or something.
Okay. Okay, so the second dwelling units are not part of this study then?
No, they are not.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I see Councillor Hildebrand.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you again for the presentation. Item 5, electrical power services. My question is similar to Councillor Olson. Why is that not included in the DC study?
So, Council, if I, Your Worship, if I can.
Yep, go ahead.
Think for today's purpose, it's really just easier if we think of this as the mini update. You'll recall Council gave staff direction, which is ultimately why this is before you tonight, to conduct a mini update, since in 2019 we did do the development charges review. So this council at its start did a full review. And tonight, what we're really doing is making a couple of structural changes because, as Mr. Tan said, sort of the laws changed and we're accounting slightly differently for two different kinds of recreation that were formerly in two categories that are now in one, and because the MCC is running at full tilt and to sort of capture those pieces. So this is just this tiny update, and it's really just that's in front of you this evening, and that's why this study was just a few $1,000s, because it's just the update on that one point. All the other pieces we'll come back to in due course, likely in front of the next council. So we've already done the main work, and there's sort of two changes we wanted to capture, which is what's resulting in this mini update, if you will. Mr. Tan, is mini update an okay non-technical term?
For this case, I think it'd be fine to say that. I think it'd be fine to say so.
So all those other areas you're asking were not looked at for this mini update, and won't be again for this in this term of council, because it's kind of too close to the last time we did it.
Okay. All right, you okay with that, Councillor Hildebrand?
No comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on the presentation made tonight? Not seeing any. Thank you again. We will now turn to Madam Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you. That will bring us to the public input portion of the meeting. Our first pre-registered member of the public is Mr. Mark Schultz. I'll just ask Ms. Leach to bring Mr. Schultz into the meeting, if council can give us a moment.
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Schultz, we do see that you're in the meeting. If you'd like, you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you so wish. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, welcome, Mr. Schultz. You have the floor.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and councillors. Thank you for the opportunity to address this meeting. Based on what Mr. Cripps just said and what Mr. Tam was saying, maybe this is preliminary, but in retrospect, looking at other things that have happened, it's never too early to express concerns about things that are being considered now and going to be considered. So I'm going to present my position to you. I'm actually speaking on behalf of a group, the Pelham Greenhouse Growers Group, and it's with respect to concerns about development charges and about other things that have happened. The town of Pelham, like many municipalities, was unprepared for the establishment, growth, and impact of the cannabis industry. Reactions from neighbors and other town residents were swift and emphatic, and the town scrambled to respond. Bylaw 4117 in 2019 put greenhouses under site plan control in a first attempt to regulate the industry with respect to elements under the town's jurisdiction. Hoop houses were intentionally included in greenhouses by the town of Pelham. This may or may not be proper and correct from various perspectives and under various regulations. There have been a number of presentations to you as council from the Pelham Greenhouse Growers Group and others about why hoop houses should not be considered greenhouses and should not be subject to building permits or site plan control. Fitting hoop houses into the definition of a building in the Ontario Building Code Act is tenuous at best, and I've spent my whole life in the building industry, so I'm quite familiar with the Building Code Act and various things. And this also introduces an argument for including many other structures in building permit framework that are not considered, and it's a can of worms you really ought to think carefully about before you open it. This meeting is about development charges, though, not about classifying hoop houses as a building or not. So I'm not going to get sidetracked into that issue, and I'm not going to reiterate the arguments that have already been presented to you, but I think they're worth revisiting, particularly in light of the upcoming plan review for the town of Pelham. The arguments and the presentations are in the public record, and they're easily accessible, and I strongly suggest that you look at them again as you're considering other things. There have been various statements made by town staff with respect to the construction and use of hoop houses that at best demonstrate poor understanding of them, and at worst, some of them are erroneous. I will note on March 22nd, 2021, John Langadoon of the Pelham Greenhouse Growers Group gave a presentation to council, and there were rather emphatic statements that, contrary to what he said, the greenhouse industry was consulted before a bylaw was put in place that put greenhouses under site plan control. That's not in fact true. The bylaw was passed in May. The current CAO was hired in July, and the visit to Willowbrook Nurseries was in December. So obviously the bylaw came first. The consultation came after that. That's all aside. The group's concern now with site plan control is that it brings up other unintended, or possibly intended, which would really be terrible, consequences that are far reaching and have great impacts on one of the biggest industries and the biggest employers in our town. Development charges would be a very serious impediment to the growth of any greenhouse operation and would virtually guarantee the end of any nursery expansion using hoop houses in Pelham. Hoop houses cost around $1 a square foot to build. The proposed non-residential DC is $6.62 a square foot, and actually now from Mr. Tan's presentation, I'm realizing that that is not indexed to current costs, so it's actually higher than that. That's for unserviced land, $9.32 for service land, and I have to point out, in case you're not familiar with development charges, the Development Charges Act, if your land has sewer and water on the frontage, you pay this service land development charge, whether you connect to the services or not. So a hoop house that has no sewer and water connected to it still pays sewer and water development charges if development charges are levied on it. That, you know, the issue here is that if something costs $1 a square foot to build, and then someone tells you you're going to have a fee of 7 to 9 times that, in addition to building permit site plan control costs, then obviously that's punitive and you're not going to build it. You're not going to buy a $25,000 car and pay $200,000 a year for your license plates. You're going to walk. Greenhouses, as opposed to hoop houses, vary widely in their cost, their function, their construction type. But we're still looking at fees that can be 35% or more of the cost of a greenhouse. And that is a significant impact. It would mean no more being built in Pelham, and maybe that would be the intent. I don't know. The reason for the group's concern over development charges is that although greenhouses and hoop houses, which Pelham classifies as the same thing, despite lots of other places not classifying them as the same thing, while they might not be explicitly included in the development charges bylaw, they are not explicitly excluded, and there's no guarantee that they won't get swept into this. The town has excluded these from the definition of agricultural uses in other bylaws, and that is what raises the concern. If they become subject to development charges because they're not considered an agricultural use anymore in the town of Pelham, what class of building are they? Are they industrial? Well, you know, maybe that's not so bad. They're going to get the statutory exemption for industrial additions of up to 50% of the existing area with no development charges. Sounds like a good compromise, right? You get half for free. It's still an onerous burden on the cost of building a $1 a square foot hoop house to pay $3 or $4 development charges. Somebody buying a $25,000 car is going to say a $100,000 license plate or a $200,000 license plate doesn't really matter because I can't buy either one, so I'm not buying the car. From the opposite perspective, the perspective that you also have to consider, attempting to levy development charges on hoop houses exposes the development charge bylaw to challenge. Provincial law that permits you to levy development charges also mandates that it has to be done properly. They can only be charged on things that require increased capital spending, as we've already heard. It's not operating stuff, but increased capital spending to maintain the same level of service. Hoop houses place no burden on town services. There's no difference on impact to the town between growing nursery crops in the open or nursery crops that are protected for part of the year to protect them from snow damage. And I'm sure we've all been outside quite recently, and we know what kind of snow damage can be going on to potted plants. And that's the purpose of these things. Trying to prove that they increase the burden on town services would be a futile task, and a DC bylaw that claims that would be open to challenge, and that just, there's no reason to go down that road. The possible broader impacts of past and future decisions must be carefully considered when dealing with these things. We believe the town should really reconsider the classification of greenhouses and hoop houses. If you want to control one specific sector, namely the cannabis industry, consider that very carefully and do it specifically instead of sweeping up other properties and other uses with the same net and possibly eliminating them from our community and our economy. There's recent news about financial struggles among one of the main players in the cannabis industry in Pelham, and it seems they're not going to be the cash cow that the town might have hoped for. The older established growers of conventional crops, represented by the Pelham Greenhouse Growers Group, are solid contributing members of Pelham society and our economy. We should be acting to ensure that they can continue to be this. We believe that hoop houses and greenhouses should be explicitly excluded from development charges. And you might say we're making a mountain out of a molehill, and there is no issue here, but plenty of no issues have come back to bite people who did nothing to comment about it when they had the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Schultz. Back to you, Madam Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you. The next pre-registered member to speak is Mr. Wally Braun. I'd ask Ms. Leach to bring Mr. Wally Braun in, and Mr. Schultz can now be put back into the waiting room. If council can give us a moment. Thank you. Mr. Braun, we can see that you're in the meeting. You are muted. If you'd like, you can unmute yourself, and you may turn on your camera if you so choose. You are still muted, sir, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Braun.
Mr. Braun, we can hear you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, councilors, and Your Honor, Mr. Mayor, for the opportunity to comment today. I've requested the opportunity to address council in my personal capacity today to alert you to opportunities to increase town revenues while at the same time reducing operating costs. Both would have significant impact on the town's fiscal health going forward. This opportunity stems from the fact that council currently provides a significant service for which it is not charging a penny. Taxpayers routinely pay for all services provided to them by the town of Pelham. Developers pay nothing for the significant service of changing the zoning of their land holdings. The only cost recoverable is a portion of the capital costs associated with new amenities required as a result of new development. This is the portion under consideration in the Watson report before council today. What is currently not being recovered are costs associated with operating costs stemming from that same development. The essence of the plan proposed here is to change the type of development council currently permits away from urban sprawl in order to reduce the operating costs associated with this unfortunate type of development. We must find ways of reducing the percentage of land paved over in new development in order to reduce our operating budget. It snows here where we live. When pavement is reduced as a function of the number of living units, so too are the operating costs associated with snow removal as a function of revenue generated through property taxes. Averted expenses being the functional equivalent of a new revenue stream on the bottom line of any balance sheet, our town budgets would benefit in perpetuity. There are two ways of achieving this change. The preferred being market-driven and the second being primarily regulatory in nature. Using market mechanisms is the first one to control development. Perhaps not surprisingly, the preferred route is also the more difficult to achieve. The preferred solution is the Pavlovian taxation of roadways by the meter of new roadway while still in the planning stages, thereby creating an economic disincentive to the paving over of much of our urban landscapes. And just as an aside here, I was very happy to see Mr. Tan suggest that there is new latitude under legislation to apparently expand council's ability to address these kinds of issues. And I would be interested from knowing from Mr. Tan whether or not what I am proposing is either possible under what is currently under the current changes, or if the direction being currently taken is heading in that direction. The implementation of this preferred solution requires greater power sharing by the province in favor of municipalities through a downloading of policy autonomy from the province. At present, we may not have sufficient authority to institute such a market mechanism. Because of this, the achievement of this goal is likely a longer-term project involving non-governmental organizations like the AMO and Roma to lobby the province on behalf of municipalities for such change. This would allow us to syndicate the costs associated with the lobbying of the province for our benefit, and in fact for the benefit of every other one of the 444 municipalities in Ontario. This is a worthwhile project, however, because in the context of the current discussion of development charges, there would be a number of financial benefits derived from the ability to tax the overdevelopment of roadways beyond what may be currently permissible. One, a taxation of the conversion of zoning would constitute a profit share of the 100-fold profit margins created the instant town council provides this service to developers. This would be a significant one-time benefit to the public purse to which taxpayers are fully entitled. And I was happy to see, again, Mr. Schultz's presentation. Apparently there are unintended consequences where people like farmers are subjected to unintended taxes, where on the other hand, developers are perhaps also unintentionally not charged anything. Secondly, by applying this Pavlovian tax by the meter of new roadways created within any new development, an economic signal would be established as a deterrent to unnecessary roadways. As this would result in less roadway surfaces requiring winter snow removal and other maintenance, this would constitute a significant benefit to town budgets in perpetuity by virtue of the avoided cost of having to provide these services. 3, as the total land area paved over is reduced, the need for accommodation of stormwater surges would also be reduced to the benefit of the local environment as well as the benefit of the personal security of voters subject to the risk of these increasingly unpredictable weather events. Perhaps not incidentally, all other factors being equal, less land paved over means more green space for us to enjoy. While difficult, the payoff for succeeding would include a profit share of the zoning conversion being some fraction of the $0.2 billion for the 450 acres of the Fawn Hill East development alone, as well as a significant reduction in our annual operating budget of $20 million annually in perpetuity. The regulatory option. This is the other alternative to the automated market mechanism. While greater autonomy to enact such automated economic signaling is preferred in the long run, that should not preclude us from enacting policies to achieve similar results in the interim. Through the enactment of a suite of bylaws, including a requirement for underground parking as a norm and significantly restricting the availability of R1 and R2 zoning in all new development, we could achieve some results today, albeit with the requirement of a somewhat greater attention to the design and harmonization of that suite of bylaws. This would require more activity as opposed to the automated market mechanism. Time is limited here today, but more details are available on request on this approach, on the regulatory approach. The desired end result. Attaching a cost to roadways is likely to induce development to assume a longer row house style of development, the trick being to ensure architecturally attractive versions of this built form. Brownstone row housing and royal crescents are about 2 exemplars of attractive linear and curvilinear built forms for upmarket applications such as would be appropriate in the town of Pelham. When such a development model is plugged into existing arterial roadways, and in particular, when combined with a requirement for below-grade parking, the need for new surface roadways largely evaporates by virtue of having been replaced by the need to access that underground parking. I think I heard a signal here. What is my time?
You're still good.
Thank you. All right. When such development model is plugged into existing arterial roadways, and in particular when combined with the requirement for below-grade parking, the need for new road surface roadways or conventional roadways largely evaporates by virtue of having been replaced by the need to access that underground parking. When encouraged to expand vertically, as provincial density requirements suggest, but still limited to 4 or at most 5 stories, and when in particular limited to the satisfaction of those provincial requirements only, a considerable proportion of any new development can readily be reserved as green space available for reforestation, parks, gardens, or any other desirable amenity. It would be proximity to these features that of the urban landscape, both newly acquired and preserved original natural features that would increase the tax base per unit of all new development. So a higher value per unit translates directly into a higher revenue stream for the municipality. Not incidentally, this development approach mitigates the need for extraordinary measures to handle stormwater surges. Council recently passed a budget allocating $250,000 for the remediation of inadequate design in just one such stormwater system. How many stormwater retention ponds do we have scattered throughout our town? As such expenditures expenditures will only increase in time with the increasing effects of climate change, we would be better off designing for this eventuality today by leaving more land in its natural state to soak up stormwater surges. We simply must get a hold of developer addiction to urban sprawl. In conclusion, we can see that through the simple expedient of a more judicious application of development charges and or regulation, that we have evolved a built form that delivers a more attractive community. This more attractive community in turn provides multiple benefits for all stakeholders. One, the town enjoys a higher tax base per unit than would otherwise have been the case due to development now being nestled within a variety of green spaces. Two, the town enjoys a lowering of maintenance and snow removal costs in perpetuity, resulting in three, upward pressures on property taxes being substantially relieved. So the town wins, taxpayers win, and four, even the developer wins. Developers reduce capital costs associated with the development of roadways and infrastructure. Five, we all get to live in a green community we can be proud of. We all win. This development model is compatible with net plus green energy production such that excess green power is made available to existing homes. So not only is this new model self-sufficient with respect to energy, but it exports solar energy, electrical power to surrounding existing homes. Attached to my written report are references and an extended excerpt for your consideration on the political considerations and how to get that done in the longer term. More is available upon request. I would like to ask Mr. Tan to comment once again through the chair, through your honor, to what extent he thinks the inertia might have been changed in our favor with respect to moving this forward. Thank you, Your Honor, and council members for your kind attention. I stand by to assist in any way I can, and I would be happy to take any questions members of council may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Braun. Brian, do you want to comment on any part of that presentation?
Through the chair, through Mr. Mayor, obviously, well said, Mr. Braun. I think I wouldn't be able to provide any comments based on right now, as looking at the information, there's a lot there to digest.
Yes.
So I would not be able to say one way or the other how any of this would impact as of right now.
Okay, yeah, I can accept that. That was a lot of facts and figures there in the presentation. Okay, Mr. Braun, again, thank you for your presentation. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, Ms. Leach can put Mr. Braun back into the waiting room. That concludes our pre-registered members of the public. I will just check our email, clerks@pelham.ca, to see if anyone has emailed in any comments while watching live. If Mr. Mayor, you can give me a moment.
Yes, of course.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I can confirm that it is 5:32 and we have not received any additional comments through clerks@pelham.ca, and therefore you can move to committee input. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Any comments, questions on the other presentations that we have had made to this council tonight? Not seen any comments, Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have some closing remarks to read into the record. Having heard all of the comments, this public meeting is now closed. Council would urge the public to submit their comments in writing by 12 p.m. noon on Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022, for inclusion on the council agenda package, care of Town Clerk Holly Wilford, P.O. Box 400, 20 Pelham Town Square, Fonthill, Ontario, LOS 1E0, or by email at hwilford@pelham.ca. Council consideration of the development charges bylaw is scheduled to occur on March 7th, 2022. To you, Mr. Mayor, that does bring us to our presentation of resolutions. And I do have a motion put forth by Councillor Wink that committee recommend council receive the development charges bylaw overview presentation by Watson and Associates Limited, and that council recommend council receive the Pelham update study dated December 22nd, 2021, prepared by Watson and Associates, and that committee recommend council direct staff to proceed with the presentation of a development charges bylaw for consideration by council on March 7th, 2022. To you, Mr. Mayor, for discussion.
Okay, any discussion on this resolution? Not seeing any, Madam Clerk?
Thank you. This begins with Councillor Hildebrandt.
Yes.
Councillor Kaur.
Yes.
Councillor Stewart.
Yes.
Councillor Olson.
Yes.
Councillor Wink.
Yes.
Councillor Hahn.
Yes.
Mayor Junkin.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That does carry. I do have a motion put forth by Councillor Kaur that committee receive the written correspondence as listed on the agenda, and that committee receive the verbal presentations made by the public listed on the agenda for information. To you, Mr. Mayor, for any comments.
Okay. Any comments on receiving this report for information? Not seeing any, Madam Clerk?
Thank you. And this begins with Councillor Kaur.
Yes.
Councillor Stewart.
Yes.
Councillor Olson.
Yes.
Councillor Wink.
Yes.
Councillor Hahn.
Yes.
Councillor Hildebrandt.
Yes.
Mayor Junkin.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That does carry. I have a motion put forth by Councillor Hahn that this special meeting of committee be adjourned. To you, Mr. Mayor, for discussion.
Okay. Any discussion? Not seeing any, Madam Clerk?
Thank you. This vote begins with Councillor Stewart.
Yes.
Councillor Olson.
Yes.
Councillor Wink.
Yes.
Councillor Hahn.
Yes.
Councillor Hildebrandt.
Yes.
Councillor Kaur.
Yes.
Mayor Junkin.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That does carry. It is 5:35, and you can gavel out your meeting.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of the Committee of the Whole meeting. And Councillor, why don't we take 5-minute break before we begin the council meeting? Thank you.
Thank you. I just remind council to log off and to log on to the next Zoom link. Thank you.